record on this computer. Okay, there you go. Oh, is it working? Hold on 1 second, sorry. Okay, I think that I'm recording.
Okay.
Yep,
Great.
it says recording. There we go, perfect. Take it away, Chris.
All right, so welcome, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all those who are tuning in from all over the world. I'd like to thank you for being here and for participating in our first philosophical event. I'd also like to take the time to send our most sincere gratitude to Dr. Sean J. McGrath for agreeing to join us and to discuss James Bradley's distinctive speculative philosophy. But before I introduce Dr. McGrath and our event, I'd like to briefly disclose who ISNA is. The Idealist Society of North America is an international group of academics, scholars, researchers, and enthusiasts dedicated to cultivating a space for the study of idealist philosophy. Broadly construed, ISNA's mission is to intertwine the wider tradition of idealism from Plato to the present with this tradition's instantiation in the fields of 18th and 19th century German idealism and 20th century British and American idealism. Our executive committee is made up of Ben Norris, Yasmin Uzil, who couldn't be here today, but she's here in spirit, Paolo Camparisi, and myself, Chris Satur. For today's event, the Idealist Society is sitting down with Dr. Sean J. McGrath to discuss the philosophy of James Bradley. His dates are 1948 to 2012 and related matters. McGrath's edited book, James Bradley's Collected Essays, is a speculative philosophy that showcases Bradley's creative appropriation of themes from British and German idealism to American pragmatism, which Bradley developed into a strikingly original restatement of idealist principles. So today's discussion will give us all a unique opportunity to touch bases on both Bradley's philosophy and Sean's, and in order to flesh out these philosophical issues, including Dr. McGrath's own work, which is situated on the vital entanglement of ecology, psychology, theological questions in the 19th century. We are extremely happy to have Dr. McGrath here for an intimate conversation about the history and future of idealist philosophy. So Dr. Sean J. McGrath is a full professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, an adjunct professor at McGill School of Religious Studies. He is published and lectured widely on Heidegger, Schelling, ecology, theology, and psychoanalysis. Dr. McGrath is also the co-founder of the North American Schelling Society and editor-in-chief of Kabiri, its official journal. I'm holding here two of Sean's books, which are my favorite. The Dark Ground of Spirit, Schelling and the Unconscious, which is a fantastic text for anyone interested in Schelling's Weltalter and the Freedom Essay, and his newest text, the philosophical foundations of the late Schelling. This is another brilliant text on the late Schelling's work. So for today's events, our discussion will be questions for Dr. McGrath from Paolo, myself, and Ben, which should take up to 45 to 50 minutes, followed by 20 to 25 minutes questions from our audience. So I'm just, I'd like to ask Sean, for those of us who don't know who James Bradley was, could you perhaps start off by fleshing out James Bradley's unique relationship to the history of philosophy for us?
Certainly, and let me first thank you, Chris, and your colleagues for organizing this session in particular, but also the society. So I want to say how honored I am to be an inaugural guest for this excellent initiative, which is so needed, really, because as we'll see as we go in, idealism is a world, and there are many more players in the field than we might have expected. It's not simply a Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel story, but there are a lot of people involved, both well-known and not so well-known. And I think we'd have to include Jim Bradley among the not so well-known figures, not because of anything lacking to his work. He is, I often say, the only philosopher I've ever met. That is, Jim was following his own thought, and like Heidegger boasted to be doing, but maybe Heidegger was doing that, maybe he wasn't, but Jim was following a thought from the get-go. And it wasn't of any interest to him whether anybody was around to applaud him for his achievements, his fidelity, his obedience was ultimately to that thought, and then to the community of thinkers around him, without which he couldn't pursue it. He was born in 1947 in Liverpool, England. So he's British. He was British, and he was educated at Cambridge under two supervisors, Donald Mackinnon, who's quite well known in Oxbridge circles for his philosophy of religion, and Gerd Buchdahl, who was a German and a historian of the philosophy of science and Kant. Jim was a refugee, we could say, of the Thatcher era. So graduating in the early 80s in England meant that you really had only a couple options available to you. If you didn't get the call back to Oxford or Cambridge as a professor, you could go sell insurance or something exciting like that. And so Jim was basically facing a situation in which he had to find a job. Now, as it turns out, one of his very good friends, another Cambridge man, Peter Harris, was at that moment the head of the Department of Philosophy at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And those were the good old days, when they had a committee meeting to decide that they would hire someone, they needed somebody. And Peter said, well, I know just the chap. And Peter gets on an airplane and goes and fetches Jim and brings him back to Newfoundland. That's how they used to hire people. And so Jim started his career at Memorial University of Newfoundland in 1986. I arrived at Memorial University of Newfoundland as an undergraduate in philosophy in 1988. Jim spent his whole career there. He was the life of the party, the heart of the department, and the intellectual tour de force in the lives of many people. There was just a lively buzz around Jim everywhere he went. His work under Mackinnon was on British idealism, so on F.H. Bradley, but he didn't stay with F.H. Bradley. On the contrary, he was quite dissatisfied with F.H. Bradley, to use Bradley's own criterion of truth, satisfaction, and spent some time with a Humboldt researching Whitehead until he found his way into C.S. Peirce. But all of these historical figures are not really all that to the point where it comes to Jim, because the sum here is greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And Jim was never just a scholar of the history of philosophy, although he's an excellent scholar of the history of philosophy. And what you'll notice is when you read these essays is that he has a very unique way into the history of philosophy. He never loses himself in it. He's always thoroughly in command of the search and tracking his thought, even when he's not entirely clear what his thought is. As his career developed, he did become quite clear what the thought was and began to work on it much more directly until cancer intervened, and he died at the age of 64 without being able to publish his book, which he was working on. So he asked me on his deathbed whether I would edit his papers for him, and I agreed to do so. It took me a decade and the help of many other people to bring it to press, but now it's out.
Thank you for that. I thought we could discuss the theological dimensions of Bradley's thought now. I bring this up because it seems that for both Bradley and yourself, theology plays a big part in both how you and Bradley approach philosophy. So could we discuss Bradley's conception of the Trinity, and perhaps you could also elaborate how the role of the Trinity plays in your own work?
Certainly. For Jim, the Trinity was the key to understanding the history of Western thought, both philosophy and theology. And the Trinity for Jim was not simply a revealed dogma. It was a revealed dogma. He didn't contest that it had a place in the confessional life of the church as a revelation, but it was also a possession of reason in a certain way, or an achievement of reason. And in this regard, Jim is not far at all from Schelling, who, as you might remember, says in a remark in the Philosophy of Mythology, he says somewhere, there was never a time when we didn't know the Trinity. So Jim was very interested in the philosophical or the formal ontology of the Trinity, the Christian Trinity, and Trinitarian relations in general. I, on the other hand, am more of a theologian than Jim. Not that I am more trained in theology than Jim, I would never say that. But my approach to these matters was always with an eye to what we could call positive philosophy or theology proper, and the historical interruption of Western discourse, which occurs in revealed theology. So when Jim speaks about the Trinity as the key to Western thought, he is thinking of its, first of all, how it appears in the very beginning. So think of Pythagoras, if you like, or Pythagorean structure. You might remember that the first three numbers for Pythagoras are three qualities of being: monas, which is the one; duas, which is the two; and trias, which is the three. And monas is just positionality in space and time. It's not the position of anything. It's just the beginning. It's the beginning. You can't have a figure. You can't have a geometrical figure. You can't have anything without, first of all, situating yourself at a point in space and time. Duas is the doubling of the point. So you have two points and you have a line. The condition for the possibility of the line is the doubling of the point. And trias is the return to unity, because with the third, you can enclose the first figure, the triangle. For Pythagoras, the monas is the absolute in a certain way, but it's the absolute about which nothing can be said. It's the unground, if you want. It's Brahman without qualities. The duas is evil, what Pythagoras says, because it's difference. And to stay in difference without any resolution, without any return to order, is to suffer. And the trias is the number of God, properly speaking, for Pythagoras, because it brings us back to the unity, but now enriched by difference. So this is obviously something that we know from Hegel. The trias is the identity of identity and difference. But Jim tracked it all the way through the tradition until he found it articulated in a particular way within modernity. Jim was very much committed to philosophy as a historical pursuit. That is, he never doubted the thesis of historical consciousness, that we think differently about things at different periods in time because those things, in fact, change. And so the modern problem, the modern question, and the modern entry into Trinitarian thought is quite other than the ancient one. To put it very simply, the ancients were all determinists, where the moderns are all committed to the thesis of emergent order, or evolutionary time, if you like, or difference, the paradoxes of the new, as he puts it. And difference and emergence into evolutionary time threaten intelligibility, as we know from postmodernity. Or from Nietzsche, if you like. So for Jim's great thought was that actually emergence, evolutionary time, historical consciousness, not only is not a threat to the idea of intelligibility as Trinitarian, but only a model of intelligibility as Trinitarian can make sense of emergent time, evolutionary time. Now, with that notion of the Trinity, we're getting into people like Schelling and Peirce. So think about Schelling's three potencies or Peirce's three categories, which Peirce describes them in very many ways, but Jim summed them up as possibility, difference, and order, which are, in fact, excellent ways of describing the late Schelling's three potencies. There's way too much more to say about that, so I'll just
yeah.
No, thank you for that.
I guess I'm going to invite you to maybe say a little bit more about it in terms of some of the distinctions maybe between your work and Bradley's work, and that has to do with a general question that I have about what is it that you view as the sort of specific view of the Trinity that emerges in the history of Christian theology? What is it about that that's possibly exemplary of this kind of triune structure, logical structure that Bradley finds throughout the history of philosophy, right? So is the sort of Christian notion of the Trinity and the figures of Father, Son, and Spirit, is that just another example of this triune logic, or is there something about it that is, right, exemplary? What is it that these specific figures add to this conversation about, right, a logic of three parts?
Excellent. Yes. Well, actually, we can stay right with Jim on that, because Jim was quite clear, Bradley was quite clear, that the dogma of the Trinity, as it was defined in 325 at the Council of Nicaea and developed through countless theological treatises, including some major ones such as Augustine's and Aquinas' work, that the Christian dogma of the triune God is not simply an example of triune intelligibility, but it makes clear what the advantages of triune intelligibility specifically are. To introduce a further complexity, Jim will distinguish triads from trinities. And what I was describing with Pythagoras, he would call a triad because it's hierarchical. Whereas the Trinity, properly speaking, or Trinitarian structures are non-hierarchical. That is, there is no subordination of the principles to each other. The first is first in seriality, but doesn't have any other kind of perfection or primacy over the other two. And the third also for Jim in a triad, the third is a mix of the previous two, whereas in the Trinity, properly speaking, the third is mediation or relation. And that's the key thing. So what Jim was fascinated by was this problem that the church fathers had in articulating how the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are three persons in one God. They knew that they were not dealing with three gods. And they knew that they had to actually include within divinity the person of the Son and the person of the Spirit for theological reasons, such as the fact that the church had been praying to the Son as God since the early days of the Jesus community. And so in order to do this, they needed to dip freely into the pagan tradition, and which they did. So they were deeply involved with Platonism, as you all know, and Platonism abounds with triadic structures. They were also, it's often pointed out that the term Trinity doesn't appear in the New Testament. There is no, the term is not a New Testament term. And sometimes this is held as a point against the church fathers, that they're actually they're distorting theology with philosophical concerns. Jim thought it to be quite exactly the reverse, that what you have here is this characteristically Western cross-fertilization of a properly positive religious structure and philosophical questions concerning categories and being. So the problem with the existing categories as the church fathers received them is that for the categories in Aristotle, relationality is an accident. That is, it's never essential to any substance that it's related to another substance in some way. The persons of the Trinity, however, cannot be distinguished in terms of their substances because they're not three different beings. That would be tritheism. And yet they cannot be just held to be three modes of one being or three different ways of thinking one being. They have real difference within them. They have essentializing differences which are not substantial. And so the church fathers, particularly as it came through Augustine to Aquinas, introduced a neologism. They spoke of a subsistent relation, a relation which is essential, a relation which is determinative. Now, that thought doesn't sound like an enormous breakthrough right now, because relationality is our ontology. Subsistent relations are everywhere. Relational ontology is what everybody is doing. We have trouble finding our way back into essences. We have no trouble thinking of things being determined exhaustively by their relations. But that thought was new with the church fathers. And this is what Jim focused on as being the singular contribution of Christianity, to help us understand what it means for a relation to be determinative in that sense. And therefore, for the three principles of intelligibility to be articulating how relationality does not necessarily dissipate into unintelligible difference, but actually constellates into order.
Yeah, great. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Just to maybe bring us back to Schelling for a second, although Bradley didn't write extensively on Schelling's philosophy, it seems like the late Schelling's positive philosophy was incorporated by James Bradley as a kind of building block for his own speculative philosophy. So I wanted to know, how important is the late Schelling's metaphysical empiricism to Bradley's project as a whole? And also, perhaps you could speak about your own project with the late Schelling's philosophy, because I know you've just published a text on it, but you have a second book that accompanies this first one that you just published.
I think Schelling is far more important, the late Schelling is far more important to Bradley's project than you would think, given the scant references there are to Schelling in the work. There are references and they're very telling. I think, and this is based mostly on personal experience of Jim's work, how he worked, that without Schelling, Jim wouldn't have understood Peirce. Now it's Peirce, of course, who gives Jim the three categories par excellence: firstness, secondness, and thirdness, and gives him the ontology of emergent order as essentially triune. So there's no question that's found in Peirce. But I believe that without Bradley's reading of the philosophy of revelation, he probably would not have broken through to Peirce the way that he did, and he probably wouldn't have understood Peirce necessarily as he did. Now, Bradley's reading of Peirce is quite unique in the Peirce community. Peirce is an extremely ambiguous figure with multiple rods in the fire and very fragmentary. I sometimes think that people talk about Schelling as the Proteus who can't pull off a system and who's the most fragmentary thinker in the history of philosophy. And I always say to people who say that, well, you haven't read Peirce yet, have you? Because it's just really something that does not easily manageably coalesce into a single line. And so you have a lot of plurality within the Peirce community. There's Peirce the semiotician, Peirce the pragmatist. For Jim, Peirce was the metaphysician of emergent triune order. And that was because for Jim, Schelling's detailed analysis of the three potencies in the philosophy of revelation shed enormous light on Peirce's sometimes obscure discussion of the three categories, and vice versa. Peirce's extraordinary command of logic, mathematical logic, sheds light on Schelling's sometimes more metaphoric, and I mean, Schelling's an extremely formal thinker, but sometimes you miss the formality of it. And so it was the reading the two together, which really, for Jim, was really crucial. So I know for a fact that Jim was reading the philosophy of revelation in 2012, when I was writing on the dark ground of spirit. I know that because we talked about it, and he was reading it before I was reading it. He was very excited about my work on Schelling when I joined the faculty at Memorial University in 2007. And he helped me understand the formal moves that Schelling is making, which are not always on the surface. And so I wouldn't have been able to write the Turn to the Positive without Bradley's work. In every way, he helped me to see, for example, why Schelling had to break with his pantheist first phase of his philosophy. Break is perhaps too strong. Turn, with the metaphor that I use, because the pantheist natural philosophy was not a philosophy of history and could not be a philosophy of history. He also helped me to see why Schelling's interest in the Trinity is always and on every page presented as a philosophical interest. In other words, Schelling is not turning to the history of Christian dogma because he's trying to bolster the Christian worldview or something like that, but rather because he sees a formal ontology expressed, you could say, mythopoetically in the theological tradition, which is crucial for moving beyond the impasses of late idealism, and in particular for correcting some of the problems that emerge into idealism from Hegel's own effort to bring together the ancients and the moderns and to show Christianity as the consummate religion and Trinitarian Christianity in particular as the reason for the consummation of religion in Christianity. Briefly, Hegel becomes a determinist at the end, and Schelling argues that, on the contrary, a Trinitarian ontology is never deterministic. It's always an ontology of love. And that reading of Schelling, which I think is an accurate reading, and I've tried to demonstrate it as such, has been illuminated for me and will be for others by reading Peirce, for example, on evolutionary love, or the neglected argument for the existence of God, or reading Peirce on abduction. Peirce, in every way, brought Schelling the rationality, or the reason, the philosophical rigor of Schelling's late project into focus for me. And that was Bradley's Peirce. And it's the only Peirce I know really anything about is Bradley's Peirce. So it's not even all that important to me how faithful it is to Peirce. I hope it is. I've been told it was, but that's not the question that interested me. And there is a connection between Peirce and Schelling. It's very small. Most of the time, when you look into the thing, you'll find a famous quote where Peirce says that if you call me a Schellingian of physics, I won't mind. And Schelling is, I admire Schelling, he says, because he's a scientific man. And it's usually references to nature philosophy in the early Schelling. And so everybody thinks, oh, well, it was the early Schelling that influenced Peirce, because all the references are to the early Schelling. But in fact, the early Schelling does not give Peirce the logic of the categories. And the three categories in Peirce are so assimilable to Schelling's potencies that, in my mind, it's impossible that they are developed independently. So there's still work to be done on this connection. Maybe someone will find some notes written on the back of an envelope by Peirce where he remarks on his reading of Schelling's philosophy of revelation. But at the moment, it's only a claim that Bradley makes, that Peirce's three categories are formal expressions or revisionary expressions of Schelling's three potencies.
Thank you very much for that question. Answer, sorry.
So I think we now are going to move on to Bradley's comments on the other Bradley, Francis Herbert Bradley. Both F.H. Bradley and James Bradley think of metaphysics as experimental. That's a pretty strange phrase for people today. What did they mean by that? How could metaphysics be experimental?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's quite related to the previous question too, because Chris was asking about metaphysical empiricism. And that's precisely Schelling's point, isn't it? That speculative philosophy is fallibilist in Schelling. That is, it's not an a priori deduction, but it is what Peirce calls an abduction. That is an explanation, a comprehensive explanation, which stands or falls on a recalcitrant fact. That is, if it doesn't explain everything that needs to be explained, then get rid of it. So that's often held to be, the logic of hypothesis that we use in natural science, which we certainly do. But what's not so well known is that Schelling and others like Whitehead and to some degree F.H. Bradley are using that kind of methodology of argument to the best explanation in a falsifiable key metaphysically. So F.H. Bradley speaks about metaphysics as finding reasons for finding bad reasons for what we believe in instinct. His metaphysics is strange and full of thought experiments and produces aporias and leads us into a position that seems to be so unintelligible. He himself doesn't even articulate it explicitly, namely that what we call the world is really a relational construct put together by consciousness in the wake of the eclipse of the truth of the absolute of being, which is a monistic, non-relational continuum of being, which we feel, but we cannot express in language. But while that sounds like pantheism, and it probably is, it's not something that F.H. Bradley pursues in an a priori way. It's nothing like a Spinozistic approach to this question. On the contrary, it's by pushing certain kinds of paradoxes. For example, at the very beginning of Appearance and Reality, that relations can either be conceived as internal to being to beings that are related, nor as external to beings that can be related to each other. That leaves us in an a priori, aporia, in as much as relational thought, Bradley has demonstrated at this point, is the way we think and speak. Language is intrinsically relational. X is B, and B is related to C. And so if relations are neither internal nor external, then they appear to be something that is not that does not pertain to reality as such. And so F.H. Bradley speaks at a certain point in the Appearance and Reality. I think it's not introduced all that formally, but of satisfaction as a criterion for truth. That is, if we're not, so to speak, happy with the result, if we want something more, if there's, we needn't be entirely transparent to ourselves about why we're unhappy with the result. That sense of dissatisfaction is crucial, and it should be recognized as being almost a criterion of truth alongside coherence and correspondence. This point is taken up by Whitehead, and actually Whitehead becomes even more formal about it and says we need to speak about adequacy, not just correspondence and coherence, but adequacy. That is, the account needs to be coherent, of course, or else we're speaking nonsense. And there needs to be correspondence to some degree, but above all, there needs to be adequacy. It needs to explain everything that there is to explain. So with F.H. Bradley and Whitehead, we're moving into this modality of metaphysics as fallibilist and explanatory and corrigible. That is, it should cast its net as wide as possible, precisely so that any recalcitrant fact, any fact that refuses to be explained under the explanation, can be allowed to show itself and destroy the whole thing in the same way that we do it in science. So revisability is on the agenda, and everything depends upon the surprising fact. So this is abduction, as Peirce calls it, but it's also the method of Schelling. And again, this is another place where reading Peirce, or Bradley for that matter, on abduction can be immensely helpful for understanding Schelling's method in the philosophy of mythology, for example. The historical critical introduction to the philosophy of mythology is purely abductive. Or that argument for the existence of God, that strange running proof for the existence of God at the end of the grounding of the positive philosophy. It's an abductive argument. And abduction is of the nature of this probabilistic transcendental empiricism. That is, we're not arguing a priori, because that's deduction, which results in ironclad certainties, nor are we arguing in a purely a posteriori manner, that is induction, generalizing on the basis of singulars. We're arguing, as Schelling says, per posterius. That is, we are arguing to the experience. What does that mean? Well, when you look at Peirce or Bradley, you begin to see what Schelling means. It means that we're not starting with the antecedent and therefrom determining the consequent. Rather, we're starting with the consequent and trying to arrive at the antecedent. That is, the consequent will be some surprising fact. This is how Peirce puts it. I'm conscious of crossing all these guys, but they really do converge on these points. So I'm hopefully not confusing their different agendas. A surprising fact which requires another explanatory context in which that fact would become something that you would expect. It would be no longer surprising. And this is what drives the metaphysical reconstruction of everything, because the explanation, and this is the difference from natural science, it has to be completely comprehensive. So it has to be an explanation of everything, of the origin and nature and destiny of everything, which then makes that surprising fact no longer something surprising or disturbing to the paradigm, but to be expected. And then once we have secured a metaphysical framework, of course, we don't rest on our laurels. It is now a moment in which further facts can appear in the light of this explanation as resistant of that explanation. So that's called abduction. That's Peirce's word, or it's Schelling's argument per posterioris. there's different examples of it. You can take mundane examples from the history of science, or you could take interesting examples from the history of science, or you could take examples right from Schelling himself. Here's one that I heard at a conference some time ago from a Peircean. Abductive reasoning is precisely the kind of reasoning one needs in an emergent order, where things are not settled, where things are developing, and where humans are developing their capacities to deal with the environment. So back in the day, when we were hunting mammoths, we used to get pretty beat up at it. It's not an easy thing to take down a mammoth with a spear. And we have all kinds of records in the bones that people were really abused badly in this necessary hunt. The early humans needed to come up with a system of taking down the mammoth from a distance, and they came up with the spear thrower, and we see evidence of that. It's the early form of a bow and arrow, but it's basically a kind of hollowed out bone. I think it's a mammoth bone or ivory tusk that fits on the end of a spear. It allows a human to throw a spear from a distance with great velocity and precision and take down a mammoth from a distance. So that's ingenuity. That's coming up with a new idea. How does it work? Well, it works actually from the consequent to the antecedent. We know what we need. We need to take a mammoth down from a distance, but we don't know what the antecedent conditions of achieving that end would be. And this is what drives this whole creative process. Peirce will say it drives the human into musement. Musement, that is, at this point, there are no precedents. There are no principles that one can draw, safely from and deduce what needs to be done. One needs to be creative, and anything is on the agenda, anything whatsoever, including fantastic ideas, insights from the unconscious, what have you. More to the point, to the Schellingian point, love is a problem that needs to be explained, right? Let's say on a kind of neo-Darwinian account of evolution, love is a problem. It's a fact that resists the explanation offered. And so Schelling says at the end, he's not thinking of Darwin, of course, but he is thinking about that kind of teleological evolutionary possibility. In the 19th century, it was all in the air. Schelling assumes that if God exists as personal, as the origin of love, love becomes not something surprising, but something to be expected. That is, loving relations between persons willing to lay themselves down for others, is no longer something that violates the metaphysical framework, but on the contrary, in a certain way, empirically confirms it. Now, there's a way of refuting that argument. One is easily enough imagined. It's the path that Dawkins took in The Selfish Gene. You take the fact of love and you say there is no such thing. There's no love in my universe that isn't just some kind of subterfuge of a selfish gene. So it doesn't violate the paradigm. And what I like about that kind of Dawkins riposte to the monotheistic account of being as originating in love is that it demonstrates how a metaphysical empiricism works. Dawkins' argument is precisely what one needs to do. One needs to actually either explain the fact with a new framework or say there is no such fact to be explained. And this, I think, is something very interesting because it shows that all the action in an abductive or metaphysical empiricism really rests on the denomination of the fact. And facts are not obvious. Facts required a certain kind of existential commitment. One has to say, no, this is a fact in my world. In a certain way, it's a kind of commitment of saying, the kind of world I live in has this as a fact in it, that love is not just disguised selfishness, for example, that love is not an illusion or something like that. And so there's an existential foregrounding of metaphysical empiricism, which I think is often underplayed when we talk about the logic of the hypothesis. And it helps us understand this amazing nexus between late idealism, i.e. Schelling, pragmatism, especially Peircean, and existentialism. Because the individual who now denominates the facts in his or her world can no longer avoid their commitment. They can no longer allow themselves to be simply mediated by some kind of objective order of things or some kind of deductive process that absolves them of the business of decision. And so when you take this kind of, this admitted fusion of horizons, and you look at the late Schelling, you suddenly see things that you didn't see before. For example, the importance of decision. You could miss it, when Schelling starts talking about the turn to positive philosophy, he uses words like want. We want more. I want more being, something more is needed, something more is wanted. Or he'll say the positive philosophy is a free philosophy, you can take it or leave it. He doesn't mean by that the philosophy is just arbitrary. He means rather that the entry into the philosophy is the decision of the philosopher to understand his world as including the kinds of things that require this metaphysical explanation.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I had a question about the role that satisfaction plays as well. But I think, you just explained it in a really wonderful way. So I wanted to ask you about, so Bradley draws this distinction between what he calls strong and weak theories of existence. And I was wondering if you could just unpack that for us a little bit, talk about the significance of him making this distinction. And then relatedly, I'm curious about how what appears to be his critique of a certain form of naturalism folds into this distinction that he draws between strong and weak theories of existence.
Right. Yeah. So we have to put this Trinity aside for a moment and think about the history of philosophy, the way Bradley thought about it, Jim Bradley thought about it, as being basically divisible along ontological lines. That is, there are ontologists for whom existence is weak, and there are ontologists for whom existence is strong. In his chapter 7 of the book on existence, Bradley says, existence is like tea. It can be taken weak or strong. A weak theory of existence is probably the most familiar one because it's the one that we hear all the time. It's the one that has been codified in the Fregean Russellian move to symbolic logic. That is the substitution of the existential or the universal quantifier for the verb to be. To exist on this symbolism is to instantiate a concept. That is to be countable as bearing a certain, and that's it. There is no other problem. There is no other question. There is no question, what is the meaning of being, or what is the nature of being, or is there a distinction between essence and existence such that we would have to say that existence is non-conceptual, as Thomas Aquinas puts it. This is a weak theory of existence that more or less solves the problems of ontology by reducing the language with which we speak of being to quantification, symbolic quantification. A strong theory of existence takes exactly the opposite tact, and there are much more strong theories of existence in the history of philosophy prior to analytical philosophy than there are weak theories of existence. Strong theories of existence take existence as to be an activity. Existence as activity. What does that mean? Well, if you think of Thomas Aquinas or indeed the late Schelling, the distinction between essence and existence is a good one. So existence is not an essence. It is the energia, if you want to go Aristotle. It is the activity of actualizing essence, of determining essence, of producing essence, but it itself is not an essence. And the Thomists are very clear on this. They'll say that actually you can't ask the question, what is existence? Because to do so is to assume that what you're dealing with is something that can be conceptualized along the line of essence, but existence is activity. Now, once we have decided that we're going to work with a strong theory of existence, there are many different paths that can be taken, but we are more or less outside, let's say, a kind of narrow positivistic line, and we're dealing with metaphysics proper. So when things of Heidegger, for example, or Deleuze and the contemporary key, or Hegel and Schelling and Fichte, for whom existence is plainly activity. So among the theorists of existence of activity, which for Bradley is the proper way to think of existence, because the other line leaves us with a kind of inexplicable givenness of things. Things just are, and there's no use asking about why they are. They just are, and they can be counted as such. So that's just a dead end for Bradley. So if we're going to take the existence of activity as activity line, you're going to find that there's another subdivision, which is between descriptivists and explanatorists. Now, descriptivists are far more common in continental philosophy. The descriptivist is the one who is no longer beholden or feels beholden to the principle of reason, not the principle of sufficient reason, because that's a deterministic concept, but the principle of reason, or what Schelling calls the law of the ground. There's nothing without a ground. An antecedent, or the antecedent consequent relation, as he describes it in the Freedom Essay, is binding on everything. And therefore, for every consequent, there is an antecedent. Nothing is without an antecedent, is another way to put it. So when a descriptivist gives up on the project of finding reasons, usually because of the Heideggerian critique of onto theology, that it always ends up stalemating in theology, they, in a certain way, give up on the project of philosophy for Bradley. And this is why Bradley was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, you have analysts for whom existence is not a problem, it's just instantiation. On the other hand, you have continentalists who have these wonderful notions of existence as activity, who have jettisoned the principle of reason. They're no longer explaining things, they're just describing, you know? And I think there are plenty of examples of what that description looks like. I think Heidegger is probably an excellent one, since he's probably the figure who is most committed to avoiding the giving of reasons as leading to some dead end of theology. So the thing, of course, then is to look at this last option, which is so relatively underdeveloped in contemporary philosophy, which is existence as an activity, which he calls speculative philosophy. That's the thesis of speculative philosophy, in an explanatory key, that is committed to the principle of reason. And for Jim, that means that you could not be satisfied with anything less than a self-explanatory first principle. The first principle has to explain itself. It cannot be simply given. You cannot simply say with Wittgenstein, you know, here my spade is turned, I cannot ask further. That is what Peirce calls the no hypothesis, and it's fundamentally performatively contradictory. The reason that I cannot ask for further reasons is because. So for Bradley, that's just not philosophy anymore. So we need to actually ask about an origin which can explain itself. Naturalism is a difficult term in Bradley's work because it doesn't mean at all in Bradley what it has come to mean in contemporary philosophy. He's really thinking by a naturalism, he's not thinking about philosophy of nature at all, or some of the wonderful work that's happening in ontology, as we recognize that nature has been woefully undeveloped in our philosophy. He's thinking rather of this this no hypothesis that things just are the way they are because they are that way, you know, and there's no use asking about it. And so metaphysics is a kind of smoke and mirror thing. It's just a fog produced by a lack of clarity about, you know, the limits of inquiry or something like that. And ultimately, naturalism is the position that would defer to the natural scientist all fundamental questions. So basically, what Wittgenstein is doing in the Tractatus, you know, if philosophy has a purpose, it is no longer an ontological one. It is some kind of self-referential correction of the grammar of human beings. But that for Bradley is a pernicious legacy of Scottish empiricism, of human empiricism, Lockean empiricism, a pernicious legacy of nominalism, and it has produced a stagnant philosophy for which the richness of metaphysics, the dignity of speculative thinking has been forgotten, and in the place of it we have various substitutes which are of no interest to him, i.e. analytical philosophy, continental philosophy, scientism.
Well, hopefully this question can kind of talking about, although it's going to another figure. You say in the book, and one of the last chapters, chapter 9, is one of the longest in the text. Bradley's connection to Collingwood and how he came to accept the doctrine, Collingwood's doctrine of absolute presuppositions. But what's interesting about what Bradley does is he focuses on the absolute presupposition of God's existence, which most Collingwood scholars basically ignore. it's very unlike the other examples of absolute presuppositions Collingwood gives. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on Bradley's connection to Collingwood and the absolute presupposition of God's existence.
Yeah, Bradley wrestled with the Collingwood essay, and it became a massive thing. He was working on it, I think, in 2010, and he wrestled with it as dealing with sort of unfinished business, because his very earliest work in philosophy concerned the problem of history, historicity, historical consciousness, the problem of recognizing that time is never bringing us back to the same, but always bringing us into something new, which in a certain way destabilizes the things that we've secured, and also brings into question our own position within time. You know, as in Nietzsche's famous essay on the uses and abuses of history, where we're this kind of vertiginous perspectivism that was something that was on Bradley's mind from the very beginning. You can see it in a review essay of Gadamer's Truth and Method. And so, of course, that's also Collingwood's question too. Collingwood is in some respects the Gadamer of the British idealist tradition. It's also interesting to think that Bradley is in the line of Collingwood, because I believe Donald McKinnon, Bradley's supervisor, was a student of Collingwood's. So there is a kind of lineage there. The idea of basic presuppositions is Collingwood's way of speaking of what Gadamer calls tradition, that at a certain point, we belong to traditions that enable our thinking and our investigation, and are therefore to that degree unavailable to us for full critique. Now, that doesn't mean we should just passively accept the traditions into which we're thrown, but at some point we are going to hit something that we cannot investigate further, not because we're naturalists and we say, here, my spade is turned, but because what we're investigating is what makes possible the investigation itself. It's a basic presupposition. It cannot be expressed propositionally. It's not available as something that might or might not be true, but it is the frame of reference for everything that we articulate as being possibly true or false. The basic presupposition that Bradley is interested in Collingwood is not simply the existence of God, but the Trinitarian creed. Collingwood's idea that we belong to Nicene Christianity, and Nicene Christianity is Christendom, is modernity, is the West. And this Trinitarian creed is not simply something we might take or leave, but it actually makes possible our science, our politics, and our philosophy. And of course, one sees that Bradley runs with this even further than Collingwood will, showing that the Trinitarian thought can be expressed formally as an ontology of intelligibility, of emergent order, and so on. But the reason Collingwood's thesis was so troubling for Bradley was because Bradley was, in some respects, committed to the idea that we should be able to at least define, the self-explanatory explanation or the origin of things. Bradley is committed to the project of reason, and Collingwood borders on relativism if he doesn't in fact become a historical relativist. And so this was a problem for Bradley as far as I understood the trajectory of his work, because it meant that he had to qualify his commitment to the principle of reason with the equally essential claim that we are products of history, and history produces us, we don't produce it, and history determines us. And this is where we get, Bradley's magnificent notion of truth as historical event. It comes out of this recognition. It is made possible by the tradition that we ourselves are, and therefore there's going to be always something opaque, one could say, in the investigation of first principles or the discussion of origins. That shouldn't, however, lead us into a kind of relativism. It should lead us into this metaphysics in a new key, speculative philosophy, probabilistic philosophy, philosophy of a reasoner whose reason is perfectly suited to an emergent order, an order that is not yet finished. We cannot actually give a complete account not only of our origins, but also of the end, because the end hasn't occurred yet. Things are not finished. We're not in a complete universe. This is also related to his objection to F.H. Bradley, who understands infinity to be kind of a finished and complete absolute from which we've departed in our speech. For Bradley, as for Peirce, as for Schelling, I'm not so sure for Collingwood, but for the speculative metaphysics that Bradley's interested in advancing, our philosophy is incomplete, not because reality is irrational, but because it's not finished. And this thought of an emerging order is, in some respects, the legacy of Christendom. It is the legacy. It is the Western thought. It's not necessarily a problem, let's say, for Chinese thought. It seems to me that it would be much easier for a Taoist or somebody schooled in Taoism to jettison the principle of reason than for a Westerner, which isn't to say we can't participate in Taoist ways of thinking, but one immediately sees that they have different philosophical problems than we do. Whereas we're committed to this giving an account of things that actually satisfies the principle of reason and explains itself. But just to anchor this a bit, and I just thought I'd read one passage from Bradley's philosophy of Trinity. It's exactly on this point of historical consciousness and historicity and an ontology of historicity. And this is what he gets, I think, from, he gets it from everywhere, but Collingwood really seals it for him. Collingwood noting that our commitment to let's say, a progressive view of history, a science that's developing, is the product of a theological tradition, the basic presuppositions of which cannot be fully interrogated by us because we presuppose them. Bradley writes, and this is on 24 of the introduction, I quote it, "A key feature of the Judeo-Christian view of truth is that truth is not a timeless state of affairs. It must occur, and it must be unfolded and realized again and again in new situations that shed fresh light on it. It is, as such, intrinsically connected to action in time. In consequence, truth is not a reality that lies behind appearances, but is something that emerges in history and is nothing other than its coming to be in the movement of history. On this account, because the real is to be found nowhere except in the movement of history, in the contingent materiality of socio-economic, institutional, and cultural circumstances, the movement of history is itself the unfolding and construction of the real. As the movement of history itself, with all its potentialities, the real is more than any of its specific historical manifestations or formations. But the real is at least what the constructive movement of history has shown it to be, and is nothing less than that." So this I take to be the next step from Collingwood, is a metaphysics that is entirely committed to the thesis of historical consciousness, but which has not jettisoned the intelligibility of things on the pressure of historicality, as occurred with Nietzsche.
I think one of the last kind of topics we're going to switch to is Bradley's conception of feeling. This also comes out of his reading of F.H. Bradley. Earlier you mentioned that James Bradley came to be unsatisfied with F.H. Bradley's with F.H. Bradley, largely on the conception of feeling, because F.H. Bradley took the view that there is no explanation that can be offered from us kind of going from our immediacy to our mediation. So it's sort of said very emphatically in chapter 15 of Appearance and Reality. And you say James Bradley came to reject this view of F.H. Bradley's. Could you, do you have some insight as to why?
Sure. So Bradley wrote on F.H. Bradley on feeling for his dissertation. And most of his early work focuses on feeling as a central and largely at that time undeveloped part of F.H. Bradley's metaphysics. And the notion of feeling is connected to F.H. Bradley's distinction between appearance and reality. So reality is a unbroken, infinite continuum to which we belong, which can only be distorted in the level of appearance when it enters into intentional consciousness, grammatical speech, categorical thought. Categorical thought breaks apart that which is always originally one and can never put it together again. And so we have this infinite task of providing the propositions for that which is propositionally inexplicable, the absolute. But this absolute gives itself in feeling. And so it's not as though we're just left in F.H. Bradley with the aporias of relational thought, the dead end of categorical thought. There is another, you could say, another witness to the absolute, and it is our feeling of belonging to the whole, which is very curiously developed as a kind of almost unconscious experience that leaves only a trace in our propositions. But it's the feeling that appears when a proposition takes, when we can say, no, yes, it is true that P is Q. This feeling that we've actually recovered a piece of the lost unity, so to speak. And this leads Bradley to suggest that really reality is complete and entire and non-relational, and not something we need to reach through thought, because it can't be so reached, but to which we already belong. For James Bradley, there were several problems with this. First of all, it seems that F.H. Bradley himself has left us with a rather unsatisfying result, and perhaps hasn't followed through with the principle of reason to the degree that he seems so committed. That is, monism, at least to my mind, is philosophically unsatisfying. It seems to leave us with problematic understanding of our moral responsibilities, our personal identities, and so on. Not that F.H. Bradley is not conscious of this, but nevertheless, monism, from Parmenides onward, has always been a problem. It was a problem. It was the problem that launched the whole Platonic enterprise, you could say. It was that we couldn't stay with Parmenides. And yet, F.H. Bradley wants to say, at the end of the day, at the end of the history of metaphysics, guess what? It's just Parmenides. Only Parmenides, not defended through, so to speak, through a kind of logical deduction, but through some kind of reference to feeling. But there was another problem with F.H. Bradley, which was even more personally compelling for Jim Bradley, and that is that F.H. Bradley has no category for thinking the new. There is no emergence for Bradley. Emergence, novelty, historical development is always on the level of appearance and some kind of recuperation, approximate and inadequate, of an infinite that is always already complete, a reality that needs nothing and to which nothing can be added. And the paradox of the new, the problem of historical time, the problem of difference, is the problem of modernity for Bradley. And so it seemed to Jim that we needed a metaphysics that did more than this. We couldn't simply, return to some monism, albeit on new terms, through a kind of a quasi-Hegelian deconstruction of relational thinking. The principle of reason and the criteria of adequacy, to be adequate to our age, to the dispensation of intelligibility given to moderns, would require more of us than that. And the F.H. Bradley's, for example, reliance on subject predicate logic, on substance metaphysics to produce his aporias was plainly something that was important. We could see the dead end of those kinds of categories, but there was other ways of working. For example, we could begin to work with the speculative generalization of the function as it emerges in Whitehead and Cassira, functionalization or functional logic, or the model of intelligibility is not substance that's sort of secured in the past, but the rule of emergence, the pattern that the pattern that an intelligible structure will evince as it develops in time, and which will never be final and can never be simply defined. Things of that nature. Bradley saw, for example, that Whitehead had already done immense work in bringing us beyond F.H. Bradley's feeling, and that the movement towards a speculative metaphysics of functions and subsistent relations in the Trinitarian key was the way to go. None of that he could find in F.H. Bradley.
Great. Well, that was so rich. Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Chris, for those questions. And Sean, thank you for all those answers. We wanted to go ahead and open it up to the rest of the folks in the group here. So if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to drop it in the chat, or if you want to just hop off mute, go ahead, and we'd love to hear from you all.
Hello. I was wondering, can you hear me?
Yes.
If I'm clear.
Yeah, Jordan, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I had a question. I'm new to Collingwood's work, and I was reviewing your like the edited book on the new perspectives on ontology. And I was coming across the absolute presuppositions thing with the Trinitarian creed. And I was wondering if you think this resembles, if you're familiar with it, with Dutch Reform theology. Like, it almost seems like it's like the work of Cornelius Van Til with his presupposition, like the presupposition approach to theology, that we should take like the Trinity, this absolute presupposition for which all of metaphysical inquiry can begin. Do you think that resembles Collingwood's approach in any way to looking at the Trinity?
I don't know the tradition to which you're referring, so I can't say anything about that. But the absolute presupposition is a way of recognizing the historicity of consciousness. And so the Western tradition has an absolute presupposition, and it converges with the Christian creed. And this, now, whether this should become the justification for a theology that now takes as axiomatic certain givens of history, I'm not entirely sure. It certainly leads us to understand, for example, how a discourse like theology, and I think Collingwood is open to this, how a discourse like theology can be fully committed to rationality, to critical inquiry, and yet at the same time recognize itself as beholden to a tradition which it never raises itself above. I think the Collingwood Jim Bradley move is to widen that kind of somewhat familiar hermeneutical circle of theology, to widen it to include the whole trajectory of the West, and to think of the West as a trajectory that passes from the Greeks through the Christians to the reformational secularization of Christianity, to the birth of modernity and natural science, and that this is a continuous development. It's not just an arbitrary or ad hoc development, and that it, as such, has its basic presupposition, and its presupposition is not found in Plato, but in the Christian church. That's Collingwood's, disturbing news. And it seems to me that where it goes is probably more in the direction, and I've probably taken it more in this direction, of recognizing, let's say, the essential secularity of Christianity, that secularism is no contradiction of Christianity, but it is the fulfillment of Christianity. Christianity self-secularizes, as other thinkers have pointed out, from the German Idealists all the way to French thinkers like Marcel Gauchet, and that there is a kind of dependence on theological modes of reasoning in early modernity, from, let's say, liberal attitudes to individual rights, to even the natural scientific empiricist confidence that the singular empirical facts can be intelligible in their own terms, and not just as instances of pre-given universals, as they would be in an Aristotelian frame. There are various authors who will support this. It's not particularly a popular thesis, however, because on the one hand, it commits theologians to owning secularism as belonging in one way or another to the Christian legacy. And on the other hand, it disabuses secular humanists of their pretense to have erected a kind of self-standing atheological, cultural, and intellectual tradition. That there's plenty of theology still operating, in political liberalism, for example, even in an atheistic key. So it's never a popular thought, and I think that's the way that Bradley goes with the Collingwood thesis, and it's more the way that I've developed the thesis in my own work. That's not to say that it doesn't have immense implications for theology.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot to dig into there. Next up I have, and I'm sorry if I'm going to get your name wrong, Rolf.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for your fascinating talk. It opened up lots of horizons that I am barely familiar with. I came to German idealism via idealist poetry, especially the great roommate of Schelling and Hegel, Hölderlin. And I wonder if you could tie various of your elaborations to the poetic moment represented in that triad by Hölderlin, and to some extent, of course, by Schelling. I'm thinking of the issue of feelings that Paolo brought up, but also to the idea that for Hölderlin, poetic language is by nature a language that moves beyond the divisive nature of abstract concepts in our understanding of reality. And third, the moment of truth that you brought up very interestingly. In Hölderlin, we have the notion that truth is not something that is manifest in reality right now, but that develops through and in time as something in the future, as a potentiality, to bring up yet another term that you touched on. So I wonder again, can you comment on the position of poetic discourse in the network of theology and ontology?
Thank you. That's a huge question. And I'm just going to take a moment to think about how to answer that. I don't want to answer that for James Bradley, because I don't know exactly what he would say about it. All I can say is that Bradley was a great lover of literature. Literature was his beginning, and he despised rationalism in all of its shapes and forms. I asked him once, why are you so hard on Hegel, for heaven's sakes? He's got Trinitarianism all over him. And he stopped for a moment. He said, rationalism is rationalism, whatever shape it takes. So we'll leave Bradley aside for a moment and go into some of these ideas that we've been pursuing. So we have F.H. Bradley speaking about feeling, which is prior to thought, which actually discloses a unity, which can only be partially recovered in thought. And that makes me think very much of Urteil und Sein, Hölderlin's fragment, which really launches the whole German Idealist project by saying, you know, categorical thinking is a breaking apart of that which is prior, which is originally one and cannot be reunited on those terms. But there still remains the place for poetry, or I think I would prefer to speak of symbol, the more generic category of not just the poetic phrase, but actually the metaphor in philosophy, or as Peirce calls it, the vague concept. That the demand that our concepts be precise and definite is a leftover from a deterministic model of the cosmos, which is no longer our contemporary model. We are now committed to emergence. Now, for some, that means there is no telos, there is no meaning, and there is no intelligibility ultimately. And we have a kind of naturalist there. My spade hits rock and is turned, and I can go no further. You know, the scientist will tell us what the things are. The poet will rhapsodize and relieve us of the anxiety that this entropic universe creates in us, and so on. But I think the whole trajectory of the speculative project, as we see it in Bradley, as we see it in Peirce, as we see it in Schelling, is to reject that dichotomy, to reject the idea that either we have a deterministic cosmos that's complete at the outset and can be categorically and propositionally articulated, or we have emergence and difference and endless novelty, and we've lost we've lost any intelligible hold we could have on it. Now, there are different roles for poetry in both of those models, but I think in the speculative model that's coming forward, poetry, or the metaphor, has a particularly crucial role. Namely, the metaphor can express the anticipation of intelligibility, which does not yet exist. So it doesn't define, and this is very Hölderlin, I should think, it doesn't define so much as anticipate what might yet come, and clear a space in thought for the reception of a new structure, a new order, a new God, if you want, for whom we do not yet have names, but we can nevertheless speak of poetically, that is, using our language metaphorically, symbolically, in a vague sense, and embracing the coincidence of opposites that such metaphors bring with it, like the cacophony of associations, the unmanageable pluralization of possible senses, which metaphors play with, and which seems to be so detrimental to science. But they need not be detrimental to speculative philosophy, and they might actually be extremely useful for speculative philosophy when it gets to the limit case, not where it's facing irrationality, but where it's facing that which does not yet exist, which might exist. So possibility. And so, and to bring it back to Bradley, I think when Bradley discusses his understanding of what existence of as activity is, he says it is love, and in his language on love, he becomes a bit of a poet himself, and he must, because love is a non-determining origin of things. Love is the best explanation, the self-explanatory explanation, precisely because it in a certain way determines things by not determining them. It sets things loose to become self-organizing and self-differentiating, rather than determining them and determining them from the get-go in a kind of totalitarian way. Love lets be, you could say. It lets order be, and lets order proliferate itself. And it's inevitably a vague concept, even if it's ultimately a satisfying one, because we don't know really where it's going, and perhaps it doesn't either, because we're dealing here with a reality that is not yet finished. Now, exactly how metaphor, poetry, and so on should be brought into philosophy, that's an important question. I'm not so sure that Bradley is so excited with how Heidegger does it. I certainly am not. I think there's a much less bombastic and self-conscious way of doing it, which philosophers probably do more than we think they do. You know, think about how at a certain point a philosopher will begin telling a story, because it's no longer possible to use categorical propositions. I think Schelling's freedom essay is a superb example of this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Great question. So next up we have George. You want to go ahead and jump off mute and ask your question?
Certainly, thank you. So this kind of goes well with what you just finished talking about. In terms of abduction and the idea of being open to new sort of empirical datum, the surprising fact. We've kind of had this conversation before, but I wanted to revisit it. It seems to me like we can say that what Hegel's doing is he's embracing actuality over potentiality. If you read the section on modality in the Science of Logic, where actuality, following Aristotle, actuality is, in a sense, the sort of core to all the other modalities. And I think there's a phenomenological implication to that, where if you are thinking actuality, you're always thinking backwards. You're looking at what's already come. You're looking at what's been actualized already, right? And so then we end up with the owl of Minerva fleeing at dawn, right? Or flying at dawn. You're only looking backwards. And of course, the whole phenomenology of spirit, you're looking back at what's happened at the end and recollecting it. So there's as someone who was working on Hegel, I can see the the orientation towards what's already been actualized in Hegel. Although I think there are resources within Hegel to talk about openness to the new that might be a little bit more subtle than some people interpret in Hegel. But my question then is, for Bradley or for Schelling, if we have this orientation towards the potential and the primacy of the potentiality, I know you've also spoken of Heidegger as sort of adopting that from Schelling. What then becomes of, what are the resources within these thinkers to think about what Hegel's doing in terms of how do we think about actuality? How do we think about, looking backwards, that whole project, the whole project of looking towards what's been actualized? I mean, it seems to me that the ultimate truth would have to be some synthesis of the two. I can certainly see where Hegel is oriented in the one way, but how would we then understand this other methodology of sort of looking backwards towards the actual in this new world of the primacy of the potential?
Yeah, thanks, George. So you're quite right to bring Hegel and Aristotle together. Hegel is the Aristotelian of his age, and the fundamental thesis there is that potencies are determined by their acts, right? So the potency cannot be prior to the act because the potency is determined by the act. The potency is the potency for the act. It's not potency for anything. It's not just potency as such, it's potency for actuality. And so the primacy of the actual there. And you're also quite right in seeing that there's something, what we could call something of eternity speaks in that language. Toti te aine, the essence is that which a thing always was. And so we're always returning in a consoling way, I think, to an intelligibility which is not new, but it's was implicit in the origin, and has now become explicit in a new way. Perhaps that's the place for novelty in Hegel. Explicit in a new way, but the new thing the new thing that has been made explicit is a return to what the thing was. It is a telos, right? A telos, which is an end that is implicit in its beginning. Now, the other way of thinking, let's say represented by Schelling, Peirce, Bradley, is to see not potency as prior to actuality, but possibility as prior to both. And possibility is not determined by actuality. On the contrary, possibility is not determined by anything. It is the determinable, not the determined. It is the determinable which gives rise to the determinations of act potency complexes, but is never exhausted by them. And so you have these two models of a kind of inexhaustible origin along this other line where possibility is prior to actuality, and you have on the other line, on the other model, on the more Aristotelian Hegelian model, you have the idea of a kind of pregnant beginning, which actually is teleologically fulfilled in everything that comes after it, right? Something like that. So the latter tradition I hold to be meontological, and it is the thought of the radically new, which does not so much demolish the project of science as reorient thinking to an emergent cosmos rather than a completed cosmos. It's a big debate among Hegelians whether Hegel cannot be rendered adequate to such a metaphysics. If people are interested in a speculative metaphysical rehabilitation of Hegel, there's a case to be made for it. All I can say is that for Bradley, and at least for me in my lifelong reading of Hegel, I don't see it. What I see in Hegel is teleology. I do not see the kind of radical openness to the paradoxes of the new that would be required to make of Hegel a speculative thinker in Bradley's sense of the term. So how are we to read Hegel then? I think from this perspective, we would read Hegel very much like Bradley read Hegel, as recognizing that historical consciousness, modernity, has introduced something that in some respects was not explicit in antiquity, in some respects contradicts antiquity. You know, on the level of the understanding, there's a kind of categorical exclusion of the modern from the ancient, and they're defined over and against each other and apart from each other. And yet, in that opposition, also recognizing that reason is never bound by these one-sided categorical oppositions, but has transcended them in the very act of articulating them. Now, when Hegel says that, he believes that he has solved la querelle, you know, between the ancients and the moderns, and shown and thought the West as a continuous whole in a certain way, and thought modernity as continuous with antiquity and not a disruption of it. But he's also, I think, arguing that this position, this speculative standpoint, is not a new standpoint, but it's the standpoint that philosophy has always had and simply could not name it as such. It's not as though with Hegel, the speculative standpoint arises in such a way that it was absent totally in the ancients. It was rather that it was never properly named as such. And this is why he can find so many wonderful examples from antiquity to illustrate speculative thinking. So what happens in the movement from the ancients to the moderns is not a new era of being, so to speak, but actually new language for understanding the only era of being that there ever is. And I think from a speculative standpoint, Hegel is just too deterministic, conservative, and rationalistic. He is not ready to revise metaphysics in the light of questions that actually never occurred to the ancients, because the ancients were never anywhere near there. So there's a much, in some respects, in the speculative philosophy, there's a much stronger divide between modernity and antiquity than you'd find in Hegel. And there is also, a Hegelian would say, a kind of refusal to transcend the contradictions on some speculative rational level. There's no distinction between reason and understanding that can sort of free us from the apparatus of history in speculative thought. And I think it took me a long while to realize that actually Schelling, it's not that Schelling is just digging into the understanding and refusing speculation. It's rather that he doesn't believe that there is something called the rational standpoint beyond the apparatus of the understanding. Understanding and reason are one for Schelling.
All right. Excellent. So we're right around 5:30. So Sean, if everyone wants to join me in coming off mute and thanking Sean for that rich presentation, that great question and answer session. Excellent. Yeah, so just a couple quick things. Sean obviously today has been talking about the work of James Bradley, which the paperback of the Collected Essays in Speculative Philosophy has recently come out. And you can actually, right now, it looks like there's a sale at Edinburgh University Press. If you use the promo code PAPER30, so PAPER 30, all caps, I think you can get 30% off on it. So, I mean, I hope that this really has inspired some of us to pick up this book, because it's been really great delving into Jim's philosophy here. Also, the Idealist Society of North America, we would love to thank you for your attendance here. If you're interested in joining our mailing list and getting information about upcoming events, you can just send us an email at idealistsocietyofnorthamerica@gmail.com. So just send us an email. We'll put your information on our mailing list, and we're really looking forward to more of these to come. We're also on Twitter. Chris, how can they find us on Twitter?
They can find us on Twitter at Idealist Soc NA. So at Idealist SOC NA to follow us.
Great, excellent. So the email is in the chat for anyone who would like to join. And I think once again, let's just thank Sean. That was really, really inspiring. So thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you, and to the organizers and to the attendees. Wonderful to see this initiative go forward, and I'm sure it's going to a big and unpredictable future ahead of it.
We can
Thank you
only
for
hope
that.
so. Great. All right.